Asiem nasieya anta Cecilia Point Talitsanatla Homasquiam. Amitsapquaquilam, welcome to our beautiful territory. And I love looking out at all these faces, all these beautiful allies. I just love when I'm standing in front of a room like this, or else marching down the street and look around and see all of you. It just fills my heart so much. I know what it's like to take a stand. At Musqueam, we had to protect our burial site from desecration from condo developers. And I want to take this moment to raise my hands to the protectors of Burnaby Mountain. I know what it's like to stand in the rain and the snow and at night and the heat beating down on you, and to sit under a little tarp on a plastic chair. At my age, that wasn't really recommended to do for several months, but it had to be done, and so we get our strength from somewhere, right? When we stood there outside under the bridge on the concrete, I said to my sister, gee, what are we going to eat? How are we going to cook food? And our people came in from the land, from all over the province. Somebody came and built a fire, and our Musqueam fishers went out on the water, and they brought us fish and crabs and prawns and cooked them for us. And I thought, wow, if there's ever a major catastrophe in the city, our people can still live off the land. And the mothers of the murdered and missing women brought us a big pot of deer stew. But all of that can change in a minute with an oil spill, with a pipeline bursting on the land. What happened, as you know, to my friend Melina and her territory up in northern Alberta. I walked the tar sands last year, and the elder who started the walk said we used to just open the door and there was animals and fish and fresh water and wild game, and now it's all destroyed. So that could happen right here in Vancouver. People look out at the beach and the beautiful scenery and the wildlife that's coming back, the whales and the dolphins, and how lucky we are. Could all be gone in a minute. So we really need to keep our prayers up and our songs to protect this land. And I raise my hands to Gabriel for the work that he's doing, for donating his own prize money. And the people are ready for change. I mean, as you can see by the province next door. And even though they're still a colonial government, because the NDP hasn't always been kind to us either, but they're a little friendlier. But the price of oil dropping, I thought, yeah, that's us. That's our work. We want to protect this beautiful place. Standing on the front lines is hard. It's hard on our bodies, it's hard on our minds, it's hard on our relationships. I missed my whole family vacation with my kids. The whole summer vacation I was standing under that bridge. And I know those of you at Burnaby Mountain have made huge sacrifices like that. So I have a friend actually who's been on my mind, and she has been working on the front lines, and it's taking a toll on her. So I ask you all to pray for her and pray for everyone who's standing on the front lines. And so I'm going to sing the Women's Warrior song. And for those of you that don't know, the song came from a lady, Martina Pierre, from the Lilwat Nation, came to her in a sweat. And I'm going to try to remember. I have ADHD, so I'm going to try to remember the verses and what they mean. MWFA, M, Mother Earth. The first round is for Mother Earth. So we all need to pray for Mother Earth. Women, W. All the women in our lives. our sitlas, our ta'as, our aunties, our grandmas, slenes, the women. F, our families, our mana, our children. A, our ancestors. We need to reach back and get all the strength of our ancestors to stand with us. Sometimes we lose a really strong elder or even a young one in our community. And my friend Carlene Thomas said, that's because sometimes we really need their strength from the other side. We need those ancestors on the other side to give us their strength. And the fifth round is for your own prayer. We hold up our hands in the fifth round. So if you all want to stand and sing it with me. Great.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. So as folks know, we're welcoming Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois here today to talk a little bit about what's happening with the pipeline fight in the East. And we also have some folks here that were heavily involved in some of in the fight that happened this past summer. This past summer? When did it even happen? I'm like totally lost. This past summer, right? Yeah. I was on parental leave for a year, so I have no idea. I've completely lost track of time. We want to just I want to just ground this a little bit in the fact that in 2008, for the first time, there was speakers from the communities in Fort Chipewyan that came to BC and started talking about the devastation and what's happening to the land there, sort of the ground zero of this entire fight. And at that time, very few people even in this room, although we can walk around and it's common knowledge in cafes and in probably even corporate boardrooms for people in Vancouver to be talking about the Kinder Morgan and Enbridge pipelines. Not that long ago, many people didn't even know about these proposals or what the tar sands were. And we've come a long way here. And when this fight first began, when people started recognizing that these pipelines essentially represent the modern railroads of the colonial sort of, interest of extracting everything they can from the lands, the same way that the railways did hundreds of years ago, that these pipelines not only had to be stopped in quote-unquote our backyard, but kind of across the continent. And so this idea of a cross-continent movement against these pipelines that will directly impact the tar sands at the center was kind of this thought, and people talked about it, But without a doubt, as we'll hear tonight, but also as you've probably been witnessing, it's a bit of a reality right now. And the tar sands are really struggling to sort of develop that infrastructure wherever they want. So with that, many of you know what happened up at Burnaby Mountain. We have two people that were very directly involved with the resistance on the mountain from the get-go, and I'm imagining sort of not just from the beginning, but also at the end when things got really heightened and a lot more people were paying attention and coming up there. So Aaron and Caleb, do you guys want to come up? Are going to speak a bit about that to sort of ground and remind us of the fight here, and we wait to hear from Gabriel about what's happening on the other coast against Energy East.
Thanks, Harjap, and thanks, Cecilia, for a lovely opening. I'm Caleb. This is Aaron. So yeah, I think most of you know lots about the mountain. And I think a lot of you know what some things that have happened since the mountain. But we were just going to give a little bit of an update on things that some of the folks who are on the mountain have been up to, and sort of some updates on some of the things that Kinder Morgan has been up to. So the thing that started the mountain was some folks on the ground keeping an eye out for surveyors, keeping a watch out around Burnaby area, around their homes, and trying to search online for documents about where the surveying was going to happen. So that's still happening. A lot of the same people are still analyzing the maps, finding the areas, scoping out, trying to keep tabs on it, and then when they see surveyors, depends on who it is. Some people are trying to stop them, some people are trying to get in the way, some people are trying to talk to them. Lots of different tactics, lots of different people. There was another drill, or at least one that people know about. Then there was a little bit of resistance, nothing like the mountain. A couple people with signs, some little tiny bit of media. I don't know if some of you knew that. It was just, the drill site was just off the number 1 highway by Brunette River, yeah. And yeah, there's some resistance there. Brandon Gabriel from the Kwantlen Nation came to the site after the drill was gone in and blessed it, and Brandon and the Kwantlen Nation have been more involved sort of with the caretakers and with some of the stuff on the ground, and they had a couple rallies since the Burnaby Mountain thing out in Fort Langley, because they're like drilling on their land with no consent, as is the way. So let me know if you want to get connected with some of the caretaker people who are on the ground. It's not everybody's style of working, and a lot of people have issues with it, but there's some rad people who are very committed, who are continuing to monitor the area every day, updating. Some of that group has been more involved in trying to bring more people in, posting maps, posting information on where they've seen who. So it's continual, this surveying thing. There's a staging area. Looks like it's getting ready near the river. Yeah, so people are still doing the same things they were doing before the mountain. I think some people are a little bit disheartened because what happened on the mountain didn't stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline. So I think some people have moved on to related, maybe broader issues, and working in different capacities. So maybe you can talk about that more.
Yeah, there are quite a few people who are pretty heavily involved in the mountain who are now getting involved in different things. Lots of different tactics. Like we said, if the on-the-ground thing is not for everybody, it can be tough. There are different things. There are some people who are working now with Lynn Cornby on her political campaign for the Green Party. There are some people, there's one person who's involved who's now working at Council of Canadians. And there are people who are continuing to travel around the province. There are other camps, other blockade camps, other Indigenous reoccupation camps, and people from the mountain. One of the things that they learned is that Indigenous leadership is kind of the number one thing, and so they've taken that to heart and are really trying to learn from the people who are taking it back to their land and trying to make those connections. And the fuel spill in English Bay was one of one of the opportunities people grab to really make some of those connections and come back together and do some work. I know we had a rally and an effigy beating that went pretty well, I think. And that was a really good opportunity to really bring the Kinder Morgan pipeline back into the discussion a little bit more, talking about how our so-called, world-class spill response handled a small fuel spill, and what kind of ramifications there might be if we actually see this pipeline through and see the increase in tankers that they're proposing. And bitumen spills, what are they going to do then? So it's really kind of exciting to see a lot of these grassroots communities and people who just started, heading out to stop surveyors, really kind of making those connections and spreading out and moving farther and bringing more people in. It's really great to see.
Yeah, that's cool.
Thank you so much. And so I just got my list. The folks that helped put this event together today, Ricochet Media, SFU Institute for the Humanities, the Vancouver Eco-Socialists, and the Council of Canadians. Want to thank the groups for helping make this event happen.
So first things first, for people in BC, what's happening in Quebec this year may be a little bit confusing. Obviously, you're formerly a leader with the Quebec student movement, and for people certainly who've been reading Ricochet's coverage this year, they'll be aware that there's been a student strike that's happened this spring in Quebec, and there's been a significant mobilization in Quebec against austerity. At the same time as other people, ECO, we're trying to push climate into that conversation. A lot of the conversation in Quebec has been about austerity. So I think for a BC audience, that's very confusing. I think even the term austerity is not as well understood as it could be. So if you wanted to maybe just talk a little bit about the dichotomy in social movements in Quebec between fighting austerity and fighting climate, and how they're coming together to work on the two together.
Well, yeah, the convergence between social struggles around austerity and environmental struggles about pipelines is still being built. We're not at a point yet where those struggles really currently merge together. Like I said just before, the unions were present. They were there in the streets of Quebec in April. Some of the environmental groups took clear positions against austerity, but clearly the convergence is still being built. We're not at a point where this unification is clear and coherent. And of course it's a big challenge for Quebec, but I dare to say I think it's a big challenge for the left pretty everywhere. Unfortunately, a big part of the environmental movement has developed over last years an analysis according to which their fight would be independent or disconnected from the fight against austerity, or disconnected from the dichotomy between right and left. And of course, that's a big challenge, that's a big obstacle to that convergence. And in parallel, there is also this idea in too much unions and too much social groups that environmental causes are essentially petit bourgeois struggles that only concerns people in the cities and that are disconnected from the reality of families and realities of workers outside of the urban centers. And obviously, our goal is to build a new narrative, to build a narrative that says that on the opposite, the social struggle and the ecological struggles have to merge into a struggle for a new economy, a cleaner and a more democratic economy. But clearly that is still being discussed, and obviously it is not being expressed right now in the streets yet.
Thank you. Let's see. What's the deal now? So the other thing I wanted to ask was, right now we've seen, as you mentioned, that the population of Quebec, polls show, is overwhelmingly opposed to this pipeline. Polls have showed 70% about opposition. And you were also talking about some other measures of popular opposition that have been really strong, 25,000 people in the street, $400,000. So there's clearly a huge level of popular opposition to Energy East, overwhelming a majority I think that's a level of opposition that people here can probably relate to. So why is it that our politicians that we elect are so offside with the population? How does it happen that 70% of the population thinks something, and yet when we go to the polls this fall to vote in a federal election, we won't have any options that represent that position that 70% of the population holds?
Well, it's a very good question. One thing we observe in all the states that are transforming into petro states is an increasing democratic deficit. We're always talking about the budget deficit, but less about the democratic deficit that represent the transformation of the developed states into petro states. In French we say État pétrolier, so I guess in English it's petrol states. Maybe I can give you an example. I'm sure you know it. A few months ago, I watched the news on television, and I saw this story about the Energy East pipeline, and they gave the mic to the spokesperson of the Energy East project in Quebec. And he was talking at the television, and I was watching it, and I saw his face, and I said, I know this guy. I clearly recognize it. And sometimes you recognize someone, but you cannot remember where you saw him. So I said, I know this guy. I remember seeing him, I remember talking to him, but I couldn't remember where and when. And it took me a few hours that night, and it was really bothering me and annoying me. Where did I saw this guy? And a few hours after, I had an illumination. I said, oh yeah, I remember. And I went on Google, wrote his name, and it confirmed my souvenir. And the place
AKA memory in French.
A memory. Yeah. Oh, it's gonna work.
It means something different in English. It's like something you take away from a place to remember it, a souvenir.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's kind of, I don't know. No. And I remembered where I saw that guy. I saw him when, as a student leader, I was negotiating with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Education in 2012. In May 2012, I remember that he was around the table when we were negotiating the conflict around the tuition fees. So I said to myself, but why would TransCanada be around the table in negotiation with student unions? It makes no sense. And then I went on the LinkedIn social media, where the important people put their resume, and it was clearly said that at the time in 2012 that very spokesperson of TransCanada was the political attaché of Lynn Beauchamp, which was the education minister that was putting forward the tuition increase. So I'm like, oh, that's where he came from. And reading his resume, I realized that he had occupied also the same function when the same minister was Minister of Environment. And then I said, so that's a good coincidence, isn't it? So, and he was also, before that, he was a candidate in the provincial election for the Parti libéral du Québec. So, and I'm not saying there's a conspiration or anything like that, but what I'm trying to illustrate with that example is the fact that states transforming themselves into petro-state have a democratic deficit. We can really see the phenomenon where the oil interests or big oil have very, very close access and very direct access to the political class, very, very, very tight links with the political institutions. And for me, that example was the moment where I realized that in a very concrete way. I realized that those two struggles, tuition fees and pipelines, could be very, very different. But in fact, they were not that different because I was fighting the exact same guy. So for me, it was like a moment of illumination where I realized that all those issues are closely linked in that idea of democratic deficit, where in French we say the phénomène des portes tournantes, those doors that
revolving door
is you go out of politics and you go into big oil and then back into politics. You understand the principle. So what was the question?
Politics.
Yeah, politics. Yeah, why? Well, that's why I think there is a lack of representation, is because those interests have a huge influence and a huge power on the political class. And we can give that example, but we could give a lot of other examples of that democratic deficit. And when you compare the resources that those interests have to put pressure on the political class, and you compare those resources to the resources of the citizens committees that are trying to mobilize on the ground against those projects, there is an unbelievable imbalance between the two. So that's probably the first reason why I give the money to those groups, is to try to change a little bit the balance. Another example that I could give is that Trans Canada has, since a year now, 16 lobbyists paid quasi full-time to be in Quebec City trying to push the Quebec politicians to accept the project. So it's when you see that and when you know that, the answer to your question is very simple. Why there is this lack of representation? Is because unfortunately our democratic institutions are under an unbelievable economic pressure.
So you spoke earlier about good pipelines and bad pipelines. I think that's an interesting concept, and I think it's also central to the NDP's position on this issue, or lack of position, right? So for people that aren't aware, I did an interview with Guy Caron a little while ago in which he said essentially nothing, but he did say that the NDP is going to be taking a position on energies before June 20th, which started out as the end of spring, and I nailed him down on June 20th. But it's interesting because it's confusing to me to think that they would be taking a position unless that position were going to be opposition. But then we'll see what happens with Alberta. But so in the question of good pipelines versus bad pipelines, of this idea that there are some people that are saying, well, we just don't want it on our coast, so it's fine on your coast. But obviously, we know that the UN has said that 85% of the tar sands has to stay in the soil if we're going to avert catastrophic climate change. And the strategy for doing that in the face of governments that have no interest in doing it whatsoever has been a popular mobilization to block the export pass, right? And so that's the idea. You block to the west with Northern Gateway and Kinder Morgan, you block to the south with Keystone XL, and now with Energy East, you block to the east. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how people in Quebec see their fight against Energy East as part of a global struggle against climate change.
Well, I think it's a process. To give an example, the coalition that I talked about at the beginning of community groups, their name is Coule pas chez nous in French, which can be translated in English as "Don't spill in my backyard," I guess. So when you look at it that way, you can say, "Oh, it's only they just don't want the pipeline in their backyard." But what is fascinating about those type of mobilization and of group is that sometimes the opposition begins by that, and it's not unlegitimate to be disturbed by the fact that a pipeline of this size will be like a few meters from your house. So I think it's a legitimate way to begin your mobilization. But what is important is the process that goes after, and that process we're currently seeing it. And I had the wonderful chance to accompany those groups in their process of mobilization. It's wonderful to see how, from an initial perspective that could be judged as limited or not in my backyard thing, you see that position change and evolve in the time. After a few months, after a year, 1.5 years of mobilization, reading about the subject, talking about the subjects, debating about the subject, people begin to understand the more systemic or more abstract or global aspects of the debate. And so I'm pretty confident that we'll get there. But obviously, one thing that I should maybe precise is that, in Western Canada, the debate around oil and tar sands is not new. It's something you guys are talking about since a few years now. In Quebec, it's probably the first time we ever talk about those things. It's pretty far from Quebec. Historically, 100% of our electricity is from hydroelectricity. There is no coal, there is no gas, there is no oil central. So those issues were kind of always very far from us. And the issue of oil in general was never really a central issue in the public discussion, but now it's beginning to be. So of course we're kind of late, we can say, in the process of realizing the impacts and the consequences of those kind of infrastructures. But I'm pretty confident that we're getting there, that we're catching up pretty fastly on the big picture. The tar sands industry in itself is a lot less known in Quebec. I can give an example. There was a survey done a few weeks ago that showed that in the world, climate change is the 6th subject that is the more present in the news. In Quebec, it's not even in the top 50 of the subjects. So it gives you an idea. It's really something that we never really talked about, because having 100% clean energy in hydro, we always considered that this debate was for others. Now it's like just coming in our face, and it's like a whole new debate and a whole new perspective. But it's evolving fast. The debate is happening fast, and I have witnessed that process of mobilization in a very short distance. Yeah, and I have seen very beautiful scenes of people that were ordinary working class people that never voted in their life, never did anything political in their life, and because of that very specific project are beginning to be real activists, because from a first perspective that is very limited to, I don't want that in my backyard, they're really fastly evolving to much more systemic considerations. So we are getting there. We are getting to that debate. We are getting to those major considerations, and I'm pretty proud of it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's frustrating in this good pipeline, bad pipeline thing, for instance, like to listen to the NDP, it's all about what are the chances of this pipeline breaking and spilling oil in this particular place, right? Which is a legitimate concern, and we should be concerned about, and we should be doing environmental assessments and all of these things, but I just don't understand how the NDP comes out with a straight face and totally ignores climate change, right? The UN, every scientist we have says 85% has to stay in the ground. That's impossible with energies. And so hopefully we're going to see some new positions out of them. So talking about the NDP, I wanted to talk a little bit about big news this week, which is obviously the election of Rachel Notley in Alberta. And this is something that I think is so confusing for Quebecers, right? First of all, Quebecers just see Alberta as an archetype, right? Alberta might be Texas, might as well be Texas, right? Just an archetype of some weird, far away, right-wing, conservative, weirdo place, right? So I think Quebecers are really confused about how the hell the NDP managed to win there. And then I think additionally, a lot of Quebecers are kind of confused about how to feel about it, right? Because on the one hand, clearly Rachel Notley is better than Jim Prentice and the PCs, or certainly than the Wild Rose. And she's been critical of Northern Gateway and Keystone, but at the same time, she's been actually very positive and very supportive of energy. So how is that new Alberta government going to play into this conflict, and how's that going to play out with Quebec?
Well, I don't think it will be a very long and beautiful answer, but honestly, we never counted on the Alberta's government to help us. No, seriously, we never really considered it a factor in the mobilization. For us, the target is the local, the municipalities, the provincial government, and the federal government, and we always took for granted that the Alberta's government would be in favor of the project. So honestly, I don't see what it changes, because from a government that says yes to all pipelines and another that says yes to some pipelines, including Energy East, for us, honestly, the action plan, I think, won't change. Maybe it's going to change the way we address the NDP, maybe, but honestly, we never really counted on them. So I think we will just continue to mobilize, and our goal is to force the Quebec government to have a position against it. I think we're in a good position to do that.
Thanks. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we're going to move to the group Q&A session. Before I do, I just wanted to make one quick announcement I forgot to make earlier, which is we're also having a cocktail party tomorrow night at 7:30 at the Sylvia Hotel, which is a fundraiser for Ricochet. And so we're charging Ricochet members $20 to come, or else you can join and become a member and support crowdfunded and independent media. So if anybody's interested, you can ask us more about that afterwards. But if you want to continue the discussion, that's one way to do it. So the final question I wanted to ask ask before we pass this on, you've been involved recently in the creation of a new group called Nadeau-Dubois, which has sort of antecedents in Quebec history very strongly, and is a group of high-profile Quebecers who have signed on to a manifesto calling for a zero-carbon future. So can you tell us a little bit more about Nadeau-Dubois and what that group is trying to accomplish?
It's a beautiful last question. So essentially it's a manifesto that was written in the last year by 6 public figures in Quebec, a former MP, 2 very well-known economists in favor of an energy transition, one of the co-founder of Iqta, which is a big green group in Quebec, and a famous playwright that worked a lot for the Cité du Soleil, Dominique Champagne. And myself. And we have written that manifesto together to ask for 4 things. First, an end to any exploration or exploitation of oil or gas on the territory of Quebec. As you probably know, we are hearing more and more about projects of shale oil on the Anticosti Island, of conventional oil in Gaspésie, of conventional oil in the Gulf, in the St. Lawrence Gulf. So no to even exploration, because we're seeing in 2015 it's morally irresponsible to invest in fossil fuels. So that's the first demand. The second one is no to any passage, any
crossing,
any crossing of oil for exportation on the territory of Quebec, which means no pipeline, no rails, no boats, not one drop of oil on our territory that is not for domestic consumption. So that means essentially that the only oil that will pass is for domestic consumption, but no exportation. Third, a clear and concrete plan for a zero carbon Quebec in 2050. And fourth, we are asking the Caisse de dépôt et de placement du Québec to totally divest in his holdings in the fossil fuel industry. For those the ones who don't know, the Caisse de dépôt et de placement du Québec is the public fund of Quebec. It's the 10th biggest sovereign fund in the world. It's a major investor worldwide, and according to our last study, this huge public fund is putting 14% of his holdings in the tar sands industry each year. So it's ironically the money of Quebecers that is actually one of the major financial partners of the tar sands industry. So one of the demands that we're doing is we're asking the Caisse de dépôt et placement to engage into a divestment policy from today, and it's something I think we can achieve, because that case is really that fund is something that Quebecers rely to a lot. It's really a symbol of the collective redistribution of wealth in Quebec. So we're to put pressure on them. We're negotiating with a few financial actors in order to convince them to do that divest policy. So that's the 4 demands of the manifesto. It has been endorsed by 200 major public figures in Quebec, actors, comedians, TV hosts, intellectuals, painters, singers, all kind of people that said we morally approve that manifesto, and our objective is to get 100,000 signatures till the Paris conference. We already reached 20% of that objective in the last 3 weeks. The manifesto was launched 3 weeks ago, so things are going well. The objective of that campaign is really to clearly draw a line in the sand and say, as public figures, we want to be clear in the public space that we cannot morally endorse any decision that reinforces our collective dependence to oil, and we want every decision starting from now, every decision in all the aspects of government to be taken in consideration to the necessity of transitioning to another economy. So it's a very enthusiastic project. We're really proud of it, and we are going to put more and more pressure on governments and investors and groups in the next months.
So you wanna...
Thank you.